will you kick off with that, Jay?
Thank you, Bruce. And thank you, everybody, for turning up on what is, as Samar said, a pleasant afternoon of warm spring sunshine. It's also the last day of the warmest October that Australia has experienced since records began. And in the context of a sequence of such records over recent years, that is without doubt attributable to human-induced global warming. So it's comforting then to know that this issue is being taken with due seriousness in the halls of government. Because what do we find this very week but an announcement from our new Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, that there will be no moratorium on new mining developments in Australia. An announcement greeted in the pages of The Australian, thus, that the Prime Minister has aimed for the middle ground on climate change policy amid rising global demand for fossil fuels, thus rejecting the extreme positions adopted by some green groups on the one hand and the mining lobby on the other hand. So that is, as you will appreciate, quite a good example of the long-running and extraordinarily sedulous campaign of sabotage that the Murdoch press has been waging around the world against the journalistic remit of separating facts from claims. Because, of course, there is no middle ground on the question of whether human-induced climate change is underway. It is. There is no middle ground on the question of the connection between that phenomenon and the increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events. That is a fact. So the Murdoch press, I'm afraid, plays this role of blurring such matters, and the reason I go into that in the context of a discussion about issues of war and peace is because I think that is one of the reasons why Australia seems to adopt in its official diplomacy and its mainstream political discourse a position on the extreme right-wing fringe of world political opinion on one issue after another. The determined heedlessness over human-induced climate change and its implications for extractive fossil fuel activities is just one example. Another example would be, indeed, Australia's attitude towards the situation of the Palestinians. I'm going to invoke here the name of George Brandis. Remember him? George Brandis, who as Culture Minister set up his own pet project to undermine the Australian Arts Council, an alternative funding stream, thus revealing himself as the biggest cultural ignoramus in the Liberal Party. A title for which I'm assured competition is far from trivial. But even before that, Mr. Brandis occupied the position of Attorney General, from which he assured us in all apparent solemnity that East Jerusalem is not, in fact, occupied territory. So this was a unilateral initiative born of this, again, tendency to elide the difference between facts and claims. That there is actually no two ways about it. The reason why the occupied Palestinian territories are universally known around the world as the occupied Palestinian territories is because A, they are Palestinian, and B, they are occupied. We have a foreign minister, Julie Bishop, who travelled to Israel to take part in the funeral of Ariel Sharon and was interviewed by an Israeli journalist, of whom she demanded to know which bit of international humanitarian law is it anyway that makes those settlements illegal, she wanted to know. Well, Julie, only the most famous bit, the Fourth Geneva Convention, which boldly states the occupying power must not transfer any of its population into the territory it occupies. Now, Australia, unfortunately, in spite of the well-known facts around these issues, still finds itself, as I say, on the extreme, in this case the extreme pro-Israeli fringe of world political opinion. So recently, for example, in a vote at the UN General Assembly on whether the Palestinians could even so much as have the right to raise their flag at UN headquarters, the vast majority of the international community voted in favour, and there were a few abstentions, and then just a handful of votes against. And it's always the usual suspects. It's the United States, which votes that way because it simply doesn't want the UN to regard this issue as any of its business. Israel, of course. There are 4 Pacific microstates, the Micronesias of this world, which quite just literally depend on Washington to pay all their bills and therefore their client votes. And then there's another 3 which alternate between camps, but usually includes the Czech Republic, often Canada, and, alas, Australia. So Australia is positioned on the extreme pro-extractivist fringe of opinion about climate change. It's positioned on the extreme pro-Israeli fringe of world political opinion about the Palestinians. Of course, there is a kind of unseemly scramble among countries allied with the United States to join in America's wars wherever they take place, but few evince quite as much enthusiasm as Australia. Back in the dying days of the Abbott ministry, it emerged that Australia had been asked to allow its air crews to join in strikes on Syria, which would be in contravention of international law. There are 3 circumstances only in which it is legal to use force. 1, if you are under attack in self-defence. 2, if there is a threat to international peace and security. And 3, for purposes of human protection. But numbers 2 and 3 are tucked firmly and explicitly behind the authority of the UN Security Council. And without a vote in the UN Security Council deeming either of those situations to be in existence, then the use of force is illegal. So it emerged that Australia had been asked to join in this illegal activity, and then the Abbott government went out of its way to let people know that Australia had asked to be asked to join in this illegal activity. So Australia is on the extreme pro-militaristic fringe of the camp followers of Washington as well. So the picture and the pattern begin to build up. One could go on. Of all the countries which have significant indigenous populations, relations between Australia and its Aboriginal people are in a dismal state, where Aboriginal people are still fairly explicitly being shoved off their lands to make room for mineral exploitation. At least in other countries such as New Zealand, North America, the First Nations of those countries have a bit more power and a bit more dignity than Aboriginal people have here. So one could go on. Australia is at the bottom of so many league tables, it almost begins to look like some kind of conspiracy by somebody. And in a sense it is, because you see, there is a state of opinion in Australia's official diplomacy and in its mainstream political discourse, perhaps political opinion and published opinion, as I was mentioning the Murdoch press, which is often at odds with its public opinion. Often at odds with its public opinion. We are going to be showing on Monday week the premiere of a movie called We Are Many, which was made arising from the protests around the world in mid-February 2003 against the US invasion of Iraq. I was one of the millions in Hyde Park in London protesting against Britain's prospective involvement in this particular military incursion. And of course we felt very much in the ascendant on that day. And it was a great feeling, and the film has some evocative pictures of some of the banners from that day. There's a lady holding up a placard with a pair of ladies' knickers on it, bearing the legend, "The only bush I trust is my own," for example. Another one with a teapot saying, "Make tea, not war." So all these things. But of course, unfortunately, in the weeks that followed, the argument tended rather to slide away from us. And by the time of the invasion itself, British public opinion had swung not all that widely, but nonetheless decisively, in favour of Britain's participation. Now, it turned out shortly afterwards that there were no weapons of mass destruction. Nobody in the know ever really thought there were any weapons of mass destruction, and it was all a put-up job, so opinion equally rapidly ebbed away. But nonetheless, it is greatly to the credit of the Australian people that Australians were never in a majority in favour of Australia joining in with the invasion of Iraq. Now, it is timely, I think, that this particular movie is being released, because we are working up to the release much delayed, of a report of an inquiry which will be the most thorough investigation of the events leading up to that invasion and the various deceptions that went into it, of any to have taken place, namely the Chilcot inquiry in the United Kingdom. And its release has been held up by a process which is there called Maxwellisation, which is a reference to a previous official report, whereby people who are going to be criticised are given the chance to rebut this criticism before publication. Slightly curious procedure, you may think. But the noise of excuses being made before the event by the likes of Tony Blair, for example, does, I think, presage at least a bit of exposition of what really went on in that sequence of events. Of course, one of the enabling factors in that war was another instance of where the distinction between facts and claims was improperly blurred in a lot of media coverage. It wasn't like this one about climate change, where a fact is downgraded to a claim. Instead, it was Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, where a claim was improperly upgraded to a fact, and therefore acquired a kind of misleading patina of vicarious authenticity, and that lent itself to the debate, and that fed into those phenomena of public opinion. But at least now, thanks to the Chilcot inquiry, we will eventually, belatedly, get some idea of how and why Britain joined in that invasion. Sadly, we still have no idea why Australia joined in that invasion, because there has never been a thoroughgoing inquiry into those events in Australia. Now, there is a group in Australia, as many here will know, called Australians for War Powers Reform, which had been called Kiwi, rather more appealing acronym, Campaign for an Iraq War Inquiry. And some of its alumni are distinguished former ambassadors, such as Alison Bronowski and Tony Kevin. There are former senior defence staffers, even a former chief of the Australian Defence Force. So it's a heavyweight lobby group calling for two, I think, fairly modest reform proposals, which unmistakably arise out of Australia's experience of being traduced by this kind of repeated rush to war, often in spite of the misgivings of the Australian people. One is that joining in a war will no longer be a so-called captain's call, so sparing us from the idea that the likes of Tony Abbott could be construed as our captain in any such matter. And the other, indeed, is to have a proper inquiry into the circumstances in which Australia went to war in Iraq. And so they're two fairly modest proposals that whenever Australia goes to war, Parliament should have a vote on it and should be properly informed, and that we should have an inquiry into how Australia entered the war in Iraq. Now, that, I think, offers an important clue, because that is the kind of demand that can and indeed should be taken up across politics. Not just within the Green Party. Many people here obviously have such affiliation, but also across politics and among people of all and no political party affiliation. So that's an important one to bear in mind. It is indeed, I think, a clue as to how we may begin to move to change this situation. And this, I think, is an important final phase to enter. I'm going to take the opportunity to publicise the City of Sydney Peace Prize lecture. It's going to be given this year by the anti-war artist George Gittoes. George Gittoes gave a very interesting talk recently on the Margaret Throsby programme on ABC Radio, in which he was talking about the decision by the Obama administration to carry on deploying 10,000 American troops in Afghanistan, which he said was on its own terms profoundly mistaken. So profoundly mistaken, in fact, that there must be some other agenda at work. And he was talking about the American military-industrial complex as a reason why we should see these wars really not as a response to factors in the intervened-in country, but instead a phenomenon of factors in the intervening country. You know, the reason why Australian troops stayed in Afghanistan for all those years had nothing really to do with an armed conflict in Afghanistan, far more to do with the political conflict in Canberra, that neither of the two parties of government wanted to be the one to pull them out, for fear that it might be used as a wedge issue, duly amplified, of course, by the Murdoch press and the right-wing media to their disadvantage. Now, the Peace Prize lecture last year was given by the refugee advocate Julian Burnside. And Julian Burnside was lamenting another index, I'm afraid, where Australia lags at the bottom of the global league table for its respect for human rights, namely the treatment of asylum seekers. We've seen the efforts of the recently deposed Prime Minister, Mr Abbott, to export Australia's approach to asylum seekers when he gave his Margaret Thatcher Memorial Lecture recently. I'm just about old enough to remember that when Margaret Thatcher took power in the first place, it was in 1970s Britain. There was significant racist political activity on the streets of British cities, and Margaret Thatcher was interviewed by a very large audience television programme, and she said, "I can sympathise with people who fear, but we may be swamped by people with an alien culture." So that adroit hoovering up of the racist vote, or as it's sometimes called, the tattooed forearm vote in Britain, very much set the pattern for later elections, electoral politics in Australia, of course. But Julian Burnside made the point that expediency in exploiting and fomenting racism and xenophobia for political advantage is largely to be expected from the coalition parties. But the curiosity in this debate, the dog that does not bark, is the quiescence of the Australian Labour Party in such debates. And that was his point. And talking to him afterwards, he saw some sense in the proposition I'm about to put to you, which is that there are various reasons for that. But one of the reasons is that the nature and structure of our federal elections makes such politics more likely. Now, as you know, in a federal election, you cannot simply enter the voting booth and vote Green 1, post your ballot paper and have your vote counted. That would be a spoiled paper. You have to fill in the form all the way down. In the vast majority of electorates, that means ultimately choosing either Labour or the coalition. And people like me, people like Samar, people like lots of people in this room, would probably go into that voting booth feeling really, really cross with the Australian Labour Party. Thinking, oh, I remember the words of Julian Burnside, that's terrible. I'm really, really cross with the Labour Party. Bill Shorten said this, Bill Shorten didn't say that. I'm so cross that out of the 10 candidates, I'm going to put the number 9 on the ballot paper. Well, as long as I put the coalition at number 10, I've still voted Labour. Parties know, therefore, that they do not have to enthuse their followers. They do not have to provide positive reasons for people to vote for them. They only have to be marginally less unpalatable than the other one of the two parties of government. And this is one of the reasons, I believe, for the unchallenged ascendancy of these various policy stances of Australia, which position us at the bottom of so many league tables. Now, therefore, at the risk of lapsing into academies and adducing a classical quotation, I'm going to suggest to you that the fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars but in ourselves. And there are at least two things I can think of that we could do in respect of some of these ills that we've been talking about. One, to pick up on Samar's cue, is to take our own action in the context of the global movement for boycott, divestment and sanctions. And we should be aware that this is having an effect. The Australian Labour Party did adopt a resolution at its triennial policy-making conference this year in favour of recognising a Palestinian state, but only if there is no progress in the next round of the peace process. Well, I've got news for them. The New Zealand ambassador at the United Nations is trying to revive the peace process through the Security Council, and today's news is that he was summoned by the Israeli delegation with instructions to desist because there will never be another round of the peace process. as President Obama complained at the re-election of the Netanyahu government, it's now going to be very difficult to convince anybody that Israel is serious about peace. And note the nuance. An American administration does not require Israel to be serious about peace. It requires only that it remain possible to convince people that Israel is serious about peace. So that's one thing we can do. We can join the growing movement for boycott, divestment and sanctions, because of course the point is there will only be a peace process, there will only be a renewal of dialogue if the pressure is increased through various means. The recognition of Palestine by governments and parties around the world, and also the intensification of the BDS movement. The BDS movement has been attributed with a precipitous drop in foreign direct investment into Israel. It's notching up a series of gains in terms of inducing multinational companies to divest themselves of their holdings in Israel. Veolia, for example, the French-owned multinational, it is having an effect. And the other one, and I'll finish with this, and here's a modest proposal for you. Why don't we formulate a platform of very basic elementary demands? And in these contexts it could be recognise Palestine, commit to a parliamentary debate and vote every time Australia goes to war. By we, I mean people, and I take it I'm among friends, people, broadly speaking, of the left. People who, in Australia, whether they particularly like it or not, because of the rules and the way the electoral system works, people who often end up voting Labour. And then we can say to all the political parties, all the political candidates at the next federal election, if you are prepared to commit to this platform of very basic points, then we will vote for you. But if you're not, then we will declare, we'll tell you that we would usually vote for you, but instead we're going to deliberately spoil our ballot papers. So there is a road in politics marked: be pro-Israel, ignore climate change, keep following the Americans to war without a proper vote, and that road is a road to failure. It's a road to ruin, and it will consign you to perpetual opposition. Instead, take the high road. Rejoin the sentient world. Observe the facts on climate change and Israel's occupation of Palestine and react accordingly, and that road is the road to success. And we the people, must take that power to ourselves. If not us, who? If not now, when?